Hey guys, so today we're going to talk about macromolecules. Sometimes they're also called biomolecules. So basically, these are organic compounds. So organic compounds are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and usually oxygen too. Um, they are divided into four major groups. So you've got carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Sometimes you'll hear those terms in relationship to foods, and that just means that that food is rich or has a lot of that particular macromolecule. And it's important to know that because we use those to build our bodies. We use those to replace damaged tissues, to build new cells, to make enzymes. So, really, your food gives you the raw materials to do a lot of stuff in your body. Um, so, it's good to think about that when we look at the functions of these and then think about how that relates to what you're eating and how that might help you achieve different goals. So, all of these macromolecules, well, all of them except for the lipids, are considered polymers. So polymers are just long molecules built by putting together these smaller subunits, these kind of monomers. So a polymer, poly for many, is built of lots and lots of monomers, or these smaller subunits or building blocks. Those are held together by covalent bonds, which tend to be strong bonds. And you make those bonds through something called dehydration synthesis. So synthesis just means to build something. And in this case, we're building it by pulling out a water molecule. So that's where you get the dehydration from. So you take a hydrogen and a hydroxide, pull those out, you leave kind of sticky ends behind, and you will build a new polymer or add to a polymer. And what you're left with is water. That's where you get the dehydration from. So synthesis is to build, dehydration, you're taking out of water. Sometimes you'll see this called a condensation reaction. That's also referring to the water involved. And this is going to require some energy input and enzymes, which are special proteins that help reactions happen. Digestion is just the opposite. So if you have a large polymer and you want to break it down to its parts so you can rebuild it into something else, you're going to need to add some water in. This also requires enzymes, but these reactions tend to release energy. Digestion is one way to describe it. Another way you might see it described is hydrolysis. So hydro refers to the water that's being put back in, and lysis means to break. All right, so now we get to the good stuff. So what do you think all of these foods have in common? They are all high in carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are actually super important in your diet. They're where you get energy, in particular short-term energy. And so you can't really live without some carbohydrate in your diet. They're made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Carbohydrate, so carbon and a hydrate or water. And their main function is energy. They're also important for structure, particularly if you're a plant or a fungi or an arthropod. And their monomer is a sugar. Examples are things like cellulose or glucose, starches. And here, just to show you that some examples, we have glucose and ribose. And you may notice that a lot of sugars are going to end in ose. So not every sugar, but if it ends in ose, you can assume that it's probably a sugar. So you've got glucose, ribose, sucrose, fructose. Those are all sugars. So carbs can come in different forms. So we tend to divide them into simple and complex. Simple sugars include things like monosaccharides that are just made up of one monomer. Glucose is an example of that. Disaccharides are made up of two, di for two. Sucrose or table sugar is an example of that one. And then polysaccharides are large polymers like starches. They get put together by dehydration synthesis, just like we talked about before. So here we have an example of glucose added to fructose. You're removing that water and building sucrose, which is, again, table sugar, which is an example of a disaccharide. So two monosaccharides come together to form a disaccharide. So simple sugars, again, are those monosaccharides and disaccharides. Their function is quick energy. And examples of those are glucose, fructose, sucrose. And so having those in your diet will give you that quick energy burst. Polysaccharides, on the other hand, are larger, more complex molecules. It doesn't cost a ton of energy to build these up, and it's easily reversible, so they're also a good way to access energy, particularly if you need it quickly. So again, energy storage in plants, they do that with starch. In animals, we use something called glycogen. And glycogen gets stored in your liver and in your muscles. So your muscles use a lot of energy and generally like to be able to access it quickly. And so you do store some glycogen there. They're also really useful as structural parts. So in plants, you have cellulose. And then in arthropods and fungi, so here are some arthropods, they actually use a type of polysaccharide called chitin. All right, next we have lipids. So lipids, also known as fats or oils, these guys kind of get a bad rap. They're really concentrated energy molecules. So we measure energy in calories, or at least that's one way we can measure energy. And so a calorie refers to the amount of energy in your food. So the more calories, the more energy is stored in that food. So lipids, which are high in calories, also have a lot of energy stored in them. Some examples of lipids are your fats, oils, waxes, hormones. So hormones like testosterone and estrogen. And there's tons of functions for lipids too. So they're really good for long-term energy storage. They're concentrated and they store a lot more energy than carbohydrates per unit of mass. They're also important for building cell membranes, cushioning your organs, and even insulating bodies. Whale blubber is a good example of insulation via lipid. So they're not all bad. Here we have a triglyceride, which is an example of a fat molecule. And you'll notice that these are not polymers. They're kind of the exception to that idea of monomer building polymer. They are made up of smaller units. So those long chains, those are fatty acids. And those come in two kind of varieties. You have saturated, which are straight chain. So notice how that's like a straight line. And these are found mainly in animal fats, and they tend to be solid at room temperature. And that's because they can stack on top of each other. And usually we say you should limit the amount of these in your diet. Unsaturated fats, so notice how you have that bend or that kink in the molecule. These tend to be found more in plants and vegetables, as well as fish. And these also are liquid at room temperature because they don't stack together quite as tightly. And in general, these tend to be better choices for your diet. Other lipids you'll see are cholesterol. So cholesterol is really good in cell membranes. It's important to help regulate the fluidity, and we'll talk more about that later. You make hormones from it, including testosterone and estrogen. But too much can be an issue as well because it can clog arteries and lead to heart disease. Here you have phospholipids, and these are really important for building cell membranes. They have a head that is hydrophilic, they like water, and tails that are actually hydrophobic, so they're water-fearing, so that's the kind of fatty acid lipid part. But these are important because they form this barrier between the inside and the outside of a cell. And we're going to talk a lot about phospholipids and cell membranes later on in the year. All right, so next we have proteins. So proteins do a ton of stuff in your body. They make up muscle, they're in your skin, your hair, they're important for digestion, they're certain hormones are actually protein-based, so you have some lipid-based hormones and others that are protein-based. And they have many, many functions. Again, so hormones signal from one part of your body to the other. Muscles are super important for movement. Your immune system depends on proteins, and enzymes are what make all of the chemical reactions in your body go. So your proteins are super important. And so understanding their structure and how they're built and how they work is also really important. So the monomer of your protein is something called an amino acid. And so the polymer, the protein, is built up of lots of monomers or amino acids, so a long chain of amino acids. And amino acids are kind of cool. They have that NH3 amino group, the hydrogen, and the carboxyl. So that's the same for all of them. And then they have a variable group. So a variable group means that there's 20 different things that can go over there. And they're kind of like letters in the alphabet that can make different words. If you think about it that way, use 20 letters, you can make lots of different words. Well, those variable groups can make lots of different proteins based on how you arrange them. So here, you can see an example of these, like this polymer of amino acids. And one thing that we notice is that those variable groups, some of them like water and some of them fear water. And so when you put them in solution, those hydrophobic or water-fearing amino acids tend to fold inward. And then the hydrophilic tend to go to the outside. And so this contributes to the shape that protein is going to make. And for proteins, it's all about the shape. The shape is what dictates the function. And so that three-dimensional shape that you get based on the order of amino acids is going to be super, super important. Different shapes give you different jobs. And if you mess up the shape, either because you put the amino acids in the wrong order or you put it into conditions that cause it to break apart, like higher temperature or different pHs, you're going to mess up the shape and mess up the function. And we call this unfolding denaturing the enzyme or denaturing the protein. All right, the last one we're going to look at is nucleic acids. And I know I'm going super fast. We'll talk more about these later. But I just wanted to give you an intro. So nucleic acids, these are all about information. And all of these are up here because every cell has nucleic acids. They come in two forms. You have DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, and RNA, ribonucleic acid. And these guys are made up of nucleotides. And their big job is storing information on how to build proteins. And then they can transfer that information from one generation to the next. And we'll spend a ton of time talking about these guys. The building blocks are your nucleotide. And the nucleotides, there's 5 different types, are made up of a phosphate, a sugar, and one of 5 possible nitrogen bases. So A, T, C, G, or U. DNA is a double helix or double chain of those nucleotides, and it contains A, C, G, and T. And RNA are going to be a single stranded, and they contain A, C, G, and U. The nucleotides themselves are held together by sugar. They make this sugar phosphate backbone that's super strong. And then the nitrogen bases themselves are actually going to be held together with hydrogen bonds that we learned break apart pretty easily. And that's it. So if you have any questions, make sure you write them down. Hopefully this was a good introduction for you. And we'll talk more about each different type of biomolecule more as we go through the unit. Thanks. Bye.